In principle, criticism is not the duty of the critic, but the most important right of the audience. So when a work so vigorously asks its audience to stop thinking about its flaws, it is not so foolish to imagine that we are facing a title so weak that it cannot even justify its problems. Meanwhile, HIGHER.T is one of the exceptions that it asks not to cover up its weaknesses, but to make sure that the audience can enjoy it in the best possible way. Red Dead Redemption 2, from the very first act, with its suspense in space, tells its audience, please just trust from here on. The trust that ultimately makes this game the culmination of storytelling and characterization in the history of the video game, or just a boring horseback simulator that has nothing new to offer. Before we start thinking about this trust, thinking, storytelling, and characterization, we need to be familiar with HIGHER.T's double-edged sword at its core. An important question to ask yourself is, what is Red Dead Redemption 2's greatest strength? Maybe some people know the story of this game and its characters as the best part of it. Others may say that the world of this game is what distinguishes it from other titles. And perhaps some people consider not a specific component, but the sum of these components as the strength of this game. Now, if we look at the question a little more radically, HIGHER.T owes its success more than anything else to the cinematic experience it offers to the audience. An experience that, while turning it into an unforgettable masterpiece, forces the creators to take a huge risk, giving up its identity as a video game. But before we get to the bottom of the matter and figure out exactly how Red Dead Redemption 2 will get to that place, we first have to cut through all the elements before we get to the core of the game and have a look at heart. You may have heard the term negative synergy. Negative synergy is a state in which two elements alone have more benefit than their combination. That's exactly what HIGHER.T's overall gameplay design is in. Two completely opposite and separate elements are present at maximum intensity, which are not seen anywhere but Rockstar games next to each other. HIGHER.T is Rockstar's best open world. Years later, for the first time in one of their games, you can spend hours in the game world and always have something to do. You just need to have a little interest in horseback riding in the Wild West or its nascent cities to spend tens of hours exploring its world. But it's precisely during one of these free excursions that you arrive at Van der Linde Camp and one of the game's main missions. It's right here that the game throws away its entire world and becomes such a linear experience that you even have to ask permission to walk. Red Dead Redemption 2's own extremely limited stages require a separate video, and we'll ignore them for now, and to continue the discussion, we'll take into account the only strength of this style of stage design, namely, its tremendous power in storytelling in a constructive way. In fact, it is the confrontation of these limited and strictly linear stages of cinematic with the open world and limitless HIGHER.T that ultimately results in a negative synergy in its gameplay structure. Arthur Morgan can hunt and fish for days away from camp, causing chaos in the game cities. And the game world never tells you that you can't do what you love. The biggest problem in the story, however, comes when instead of enjoying the sandbox, you enter stages that don't give you any practical freedom. Throughout the entire game, it is only during these stages that the game remembers that Dutch and his gang are wanted criminals and acts against them. Nowhere in the game is it written that the longer you delay Dutch, the greater the chances of death for everyone you know. However, the further you go in Red Dead Redemption 2, the more serious the danger of the Pinkertons and their threats to the group becomes more serious, and the game unsuccessfully tries to give the group time to escape from a tight predicament. And that's where HIGHER.T first asks its audience not to think. The game directly asks you to forget that Pinkertons exists while you're in nature, and when you get to the story stages, forget that it's a massive open world. At first, the authors may have some ideas about covering up these gaps, but from the second half of the game, there is virtually no attempt to link the open world and story section, and it's only by closing our eyes to all of these flaws that we can have a pleasurable experience of the game. Perhaps one of the definitions or criticisms that can be seen in abundance about Red Dead Redemption 2 is the very resemblance of a modern Western movie. Aside from the good or bad of such a not-so-special feature, RDR2 does its best to get as close to a narrative as possible to resemble the narrative of a revisionist Western film. Again, RDR2's other strengths and its theme difference with the previous version makes it impossible to see unmissable problems in the body of the game. Revisionist Western is a relatively new subgenre of Western, which has been almost forgotten to give the genre a realistic identity. Unlike spaghetti Western, the genre in which RDR1 is included, the revisionist Western removes the romantic elements of the old Western, hero, love, villain, etc., from its story to deal with the gray characters and the real suffering of the Wild West. Red Dead Redemption 2 turns its characters into extremely deep and multi-layered people who don't want to save the world and achieve eternal love. In this revisionist Western, we are dealing with the scoundrels that the lawmen are looking for, and we are confident from the beginning that they have reached the end of their career. However, playing with the open world itself practically allows the audience to eliminate this realistic theme and do strange things away from reality. While this freedom in itself calls into question the entire revisionist Western theme, the creator can't be blamed for what the audience is doing. But RDR2 creators and writers make mistakes when they bring these elements into their original story. Let us fully understand this with an example. In one of the final stages of the game, Arthur and gang, who almost nothing left of them, attack a train. In part of this phase, Arthur takes control of the machine gun and begins killing the soldiers responsible for protecting the train. Here are two basic problems in the game's structure. The first is that, contrary to the realistic theme of the story, Arthur easily starts killing dozens of trained soldiers, and none of the rest of the gang is killed during the heist, and only one of them goes to jail. This stage is one of those stages where RDR2 relinquishes its identity as a realistic story, asking its audience not to think about what they see and to be content with these Call of Duty-like stages. The second problem, however, is something that almost comes into the story for the first time. During this part of the game, for Arthur to redemption, we see a very clear example of the paradox of narrative and gameplay, ludonarrative dissonance. Arthur Morgan, who until recently talked to a nun about the fear of death and overpaid a widow, now kills dozens of innocent soldiers without any punishment from gameplay. In fact, how do we know if one of these soldiers has the same disease as Arthur? How do you know that one of them is not the same age as Jamie Gillis, Mary's brother? How do you know that another woman will not be widowed by the death of one of these soldiers? And the game simply throws away all these questions to become a pure third-person blockbuster shooter for a few seconds. Such stages are by no means lacking during Red Dead Redemption 2's extremely long campaign, and the game during these stages not only literally relinquishes its original identity, but also asks its audience to stop thinking and feel the life of gunman Arthur Morgan from the frame of its authors. Having a choice in video games, in addition to allowing the audience to feel more connected to the effect, increases the value of repetition by covering up parts of the game. RDR2 is not the case. In Red Dead Redemption 2, you have two different choice systems: ineffective partial choices and a system of honor. Partial choices are ineffective, as their name implies. During the course of the game, without any reason or systemic discipline, 2 or 3 very minor and unreasonable choices are presented before you, and the game practically asks you to step out of its cinematic experience for a few moments to choose whether it is your character who shoot the first or not. The first 2 or 3 choices of the game give a player who has already made choices in other games to give the impression that these choices will affect the fate of the characters, or at least change the course of the mission. The truth is that in RDR2, the player will understand not by seeing the inconclusiveness of his choices, but by noticing the severity of the small choices, and then seeing the inconclusiveness of his choices, that there is no reason for these choices to exist in the game, and their only function is to eliminate the feeling of immersion in the game world and take the place of the main character. On the other hand, we have a system of honor, or salvation system, that is different from all the elements we have examined so far. The honor system in Red Dead Redemption 2 not only wreck into the realism of the story that the game has always tried to convey, but it even negatively affects the gameplay and enjoyment of the effect for many audiences simply because of its importance. In fact, the audience who chooses to give up Rockstar's dynamic sandbox and having a Arthur Morgan as a noble who doesn't go to the massacre in the cities or hijack the train is still enough to hit someone on a horse to lose some of his honor. He just presses the wrong button to degrade his honor. It is ethical by its own standards, but the game considers it wrong. For example, if you shoot a horse that is being suffered, you will still lose your honor. However, during its stages, the game forgets to care about the honor system. The honor of Arthur and his friends while robbing banks and killing police officers is not diminished, or at the same stage of the train robbery, killing soldiers has no effect on Arthur's honor. And these flaws are only for those who don't know that the system is so unrealistic and manipulative that by just one day of returning the fish to the river, you can maximize your honor from a minimum. Can the massacre of one city be compensated by greeting the people of another city? According to the logic of this system, yes. Can you pay for a lifetime of criminal life by cutting wood for your camp? Yes. Again. The only way to get rid of such a system is not to care about the bottom bar in live as Arthur Morgan. You play. Role-playing as a noble Arthur Morgan or a vicious revolver is something the game perfectly lets you do. And even though you don't see your choices until the end of the game story, it offers you rewards according to your playstyle. Just forget about the system altogether and only be honest if needed, which is very unlikely because the final stages of the game will easily raise your honor score. Here again, not only to players who want to immerse themselves in its story, but even to players who want to enjoy its unique sandbox, tell them to close their eyes on another part of the structure and still rely on the game to have an unrepeatable experience in the end. It makes sense to conclude at the end of such videos that RDR2 is an awful title that has unforgivable drawbacks at its core. My answer, and probably anyone else who's been through this title, is it's not. Red Dead Redemption 2 begins when you stop thinking about it as a video game, when you finally feel the dynamics of a world Rockstar has worked hard for years and start living in this world like an unknown gunslinger in the Wild West. For many, RDR2 is remembered not by its tragic story, but by Arthur Morgan's camping in the wilderness. For many others, it's not the linear stages they will eventually remember, but the story and the multi-layered, deep-seated characters who have been remembered for years, because Red Dead Redemption 2 is a game that will immerse you, if you trust it. Rockstar's magic lies not in inventing structure, but in putting together components that together create an emotional experience for the audience. The most important thing is to feel like watching a movie. The graphic style of the game is not photorealistic, but rather the style of a painting that is as close to reality as possible but has not forgotten its own painting, and uses its platform to create a dramatic scene. Rockstar's magic lies not in inventing structure, but in putting together components that together create an emotional experience for the audience. The most important thing is to feel like watching a movie. The graphic style of the game is not photorealistic, but rather the style of a painting that is as close to reality as possible but has not forgotten its own painting, and uses its platform to create a dramatic scene. The whole purpose of the game is to quietly transform from a video game to an indistinguishable reality, and easily succeeds in its goal because knows that his audience trusts the experience he was created for.